Welcome to the Ad Hoc Olympics Committee. I believe we have a quorum. I see we have our CLA conducting court to my left. But we do have Mr. O'Farrell is with us, Mr. Buscaino, Mr. Bloomingfield, Mr. Price, and myself, so we can get started. So if you take your seats, Madam Clerk, what's before this committee?
There are two reports from the City Administrative Officer and the Chief Legislative Analyst relative to a review of the proposed budget for the 2024 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games and relative to a proposed Memorandum of Understanding between the City and LA24.
Okay, why don't we bring the principals, if you'd come forward and sit at the center table, and let's do the MOU first, and then we'll walk through the budget. Miguel, we're going to make you talk the whole time. We'll get every cent out of you that we can. Every dime.
Good morning. What you have before you is a Memorandum of Understanding that has been negotiated between the City Attorney, the CLA, and my office, and the LA24 Committee. That is consistent with the direction that your committee and your council provided us when you originally adopted the joinder agreement. And as part of that direction, you wanted to ensure that the city was protected both in any liabilities that may result of the games, as well as any decision-making, and able to participate in any decision-making throughout the process. And what this MOU, in fact, does provide you both assurances. In regards to the decision-making, the city will, in fact, have full representation in the committee, as well as other subcommittees that are established as the games proceed. The city will also have the authority to participate and make decisions as to the relocating of any activity outside of the city. The final contract that will be submitted to you will illustrate where, in fact, all of the activities will be located, both inside of the city and outside of the city. And should there be a decision or a recommendation to move an activity outside of the city of Los Angeles, the council will be asked to participate in that decision making.
Okay, let's spend 2 seconds on that. So basically what we're saying is any of the venues within the city of Los Angeles, as long as if there's movement and it stays within the city of Los Angeles, then we're comfortable with that. This body would then, the time that we would have a conversation about it is if there was a desire to move a venue outside of the city of Los Angeles. So we're given authority for movement. It's just if it's outside of the city, then it comes back to this committee, correct?
That is correct. I think that LA24 express the need for flexibility within the city, and so should there be a change of venue for any activity within the city, the committee will have that authority to make those changes. It's when it's being considered outside of the city. And one of the things that we encourage that those recommendations come well in advance of the ultimate decision, even if there's a high likelihood, but not 100% certainty, so that the committee could proceed forward and begin the negotiation and exploratory process. So should there be any recommendation to move an activity outside of the city, then we encourage the committee to move as quickly as possible to inform your council that that may in fact occur or that it's being considered. So they essentially get pre-authorization to give him the ability to effectively negotiate with a new venue.
I would make one small point about about that. It's the city that must approve it. So this committee, the council decides to delegate to this committee that authority. That's fine, but I think probably reading the memorandum of understanding fairly would be the full council normally.
No, I get that.
Sure.
I get that. It's just, I misspoke.
There are other elements of this MOU that also ensure a level of transparency in reporting so that the council and mayor are fully aware of any budgetary changes that are occurring on a regular basis. It outlines a series of insurance programs to protect the city in the event of anything outside of our control, both for the venues as for the games as a whole. And probably the most important part of this MOU is that it establishes a requirement to have a contingency or a sort of a protected reserve, not only by the time prior to any closure of the entire games as a whole. This was something that was particularly important for us in light of the fact that the city is providing the final guarantee. So as it's outlined in this MOU, there would need to be $250 million set aside prior to the closure of the games as a whole to ensure that the city is protected should there be outstanding costs that are not foreseen today. And of course, this is within a larger contingency that the committee will have flexibility to utilize for cash flow purposes and for other purposes. But at the end, the city is requiring that 250. They obviously can access it, but if they are seeking to do so, must get your authorization prior. I don't know, Sharon, if you want to add anything more to that.
And I do want to add that we've been joined by Mr. Paul Krikorian. Yes.
Just a few additional comments. So there's also an annual reporting requirement that LA24 or the OCOG would present to the City Council related to the budget, as well as any venue changes and their financial status.
I like LA24 better than OCOG. Okay, so anyway, go ahead.
So in addition to that, we really believe that this MOU represents the partnership of the city in putting on the best games possible in a fiscally sound fashion. So we really have worked very well with LA24. We believe that this agreement is also beneficial to the U.S. Organizing Committee as well, or Olympic Committee, because of the distributions of any funds at the end of the games. It would be beneficial to the USOC as well. So with that, we can turn it over to LA24.
And I want to thank all of you. We're joined by the Vice Chair, Mr. Gilbert Cedillo. I want to thank you all for all your hard work. Gene, poor Gene, had to, through the holidays with the three of you and his staff, I don't know how much holiday cheer you had, but I know that you did do a lot of work, and it's appreciated. And I think we've come up with a product that all could live with. So, Mr. Sykes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the Haddock committee members for inviting me to participate in today's discussion. First of all, I'd say it's very important, actually critically important to the quality of our bid that we have the strong support of the city. So everything that we do to work with all of you and your representatives is important to us. We give it the highest priority, and we're very pleased that we're moving in a direction to get full city support. It will make our bid so much stronger and make our bid a very high-quality bid going into the competition, which will come to a close exactly 8 months from today, September 13th of 2017. So we're very happy to enter into the MOU, which formalizes our commitment to executing a no-surprises games plan for Los Angeles. The MOU begins by outlining the steps we've taken with the city to reduce potential risks associated with this shared endeavor. Risk management begins with your support in helping us fully realize a games plan that minimizes taxpayer risk by maximizing the use of existing and planned world-class facilities and venues, including using UCLA as the athletes' village. This no surprises approach is best reflected in our budget, which is a prudent, realistic, and is designed to protect taxpayers. Our budget and plan are more detailed and comprehensive because of the independent review conducted by the city's selected reviewer, KPMG, as well as our weekly meetings with city staff and participating in community meetings with residents in each of the 15 Los Angeles City Council districts. Our games budget also includes a substantial contingency, as has been discussed, to protect against additional costs that arise from unknown events or changed circumstances. And our plan includes an insurance package, as has also been discussed, that is comprehensive both in its scale and coverage and will extend to the city. The MOU memorializes each of these commitments to help us minimize risk and to host a spectacular Olympic and Paralympic Games. But the MOU is more than a risk management process. It outlines a deep partnership between the organizing committee, LA 2024, and the city. That partnership begins with an agreement for the city's representatives to fill 1/6 of the organizing committee's board of directors. This board will govern all of the organizing committee's major decisions. Creating a strong partnership also requires clear delineation of the roles and responsibilities of the city and the organizing committee, that they play independent of each other. For example, we fully understand that the organizing committee cannot make commitments on the city's behalf. And equally critical, the city is committed to give the organizing committee the flexibility to operate within a prudent budget and make changes to the games plan if necessary. We welcome our enhanced partnership with the city in executing our prudent budget. This MOU ensures that we're being transparent about our games budget and planning through the next 7 years of planning and games delivery. We're happy to set aside a portion of our projected contingency, $250 million, over which we will need to receive city consent before accessing. This approach is consistent with our prudent budgeting practices and our desire for the city to have a high degree of confidence in our games planning through the 7-year partnership. Finally, we want to thank Miguel, Sharon, and Jim for their incredible work to lay the groundwork for this partnership between the organizing committee and the city. Your work has not just been in service to the city and the organizing committee, but to the entire Olympic movement. If Los Angeles is selected, I believe this MOU framework will be an important precedent for the delivery of Olympic and Paralympic Games for years to come. I also want to give a special thank you to Miguel on his last day here at the city. Miguel, all of us at LA 2024 appreciate your excellent work and leadership, not just on the Olympics, but on the city's finances, on homelessness, and some of the city's biggest challenges. We wish you continued success in your new role at the Los Angeles County Fair Association. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
If I can just also indicate that in addition to the MOU, there's an additional instruction in our report which would ask the CAO and CLA along with LA24 to report back to you prior to the submission of Stage 3, which includes the city's approval of the host city contract. In addition to that, it will require the approval, the submittal first by LA24 and your approval of the opening and closing ceremonies plan, as well as the Stage 3 venues, which have yet to be submitted to the city.
I would add, prior to doing that, we will have an analysis of the host city contract for the committee and ultimately the council.
Okay. Second. All right. So then without objection, what can you say, and I know we're working on it, but there are some concerns, or not concerns, but can you shed light? I'm trying to carefully word this. What can you say about the where we are and what this committee's role might be where it relates to opening and closing ceremonies?
So the MOU itself specifies that the opening and closing ceremonies plan would require the express approval of the city. LA24 is working on that plan as we speak. They will be presenting it to you for approval. This approval will happen before the city's approval of the host city contract. Any subsequent changes to that opening and closing ceremonies plan will require also the city approval.
Okay. Members, why don't we go into the budget and then we can, or do you want to ask some questions now? Why don't we now go into the budget portion, and if we could get the rep from KPMG to come on up. I thought I saw her. Yes, I do. Yes, we saved a seat for you next to Big Jim. So why don't we kind of walk through the budget, and then we can find out from her how realistic it is.
Of course. Good morning. Again, I'm Dee Dee Owens, a partner with KPMG, and I led our work on the budget assessment. So, as outlined in our report, KPMG did a thorough review in working with LA24 and the city and going through the budget. We looked at each line item of the budget. We compared the budget to basically industry practices. We brought in experts for each section of the budget to assess basically the completeness, the reasonableness, and really overall making sure also that LA24 adhered to the guiding principles that they've outlined to have a conservative bottom-up approach to developing the budget with transparency. The Olympic budgeting resources that we brought in were impressed with the level of detail and the support behind the numbers in the budget, the models associated with determining the budget, and how many different iterations of different line items LA24 went through to determine which conservative number that they would determine is the right number. Our report outlines that we feel our conclusion was the budget is reasonable, complete, and is adherence to the bottoms-up approach and the conservative approach. There's a few areas that we outlined that are items that should be considered going forward and just something that plans should be behind to ensure that as the process moves forward, that there's continued focus on this budget to make sure that if any other plans are developed, adherence to this main budget is basically the basis of that.
Did anybody else, or Gene, you want to speak to that before we open it up to questions?
I would say that we're very happy to have had a good process with KPMG. We worked very closely to provide them as much information as they needed to assess the budget and provide you an independent review, and it's been a good working relationship. I think we've learned from them because of the expertise they brought to the table from people who were independent of us, who'd been through similar exercises in Olympic projects in the past. So in the context of collaboration and cooperation with experts, this has been a very good experience for us.
Mr. Santana.
I think the only thing to add, I know it was stated the last time this issue was discussed, but for those who are listening, I think consistently throughout this approach, and certainly KPMG has underscored, LA24 has taken a fairly conservative approach to the budget. So it's that realistic, sound, and very straightforward way in which they presented their conclusions that makes us feel very comfortable in supporting and validating that budget.
Okay. Mr. Sykes, maybe just before we do the question and answers, if you could walk us through timelines. We need to vote on this and to give you, by what time, kind of let us know what's before us in the next, several months or what have you.
All right. We are due to provide our Stage 3 deliverable, which is the last package of information that we give the IOC on February 3rd. That's why we're in this process now, because included in that deliverable is the agreement that we have with the city, as well as agreements with all of the other venue operators, including the city's agencies such as the Department of Recreation and Parks, as well as UCLA, USC, the Anschutz Entertainment Group, etc. There are 30 separate parties that we've negotiated agreements with to operate in their venues if we host the Olympic Games. So you can imagine there's a tremendous amount of work that's involved in that. We also have a 115-page document that we deliver that answers specific questions that the IOC has posed to all of the cities for purposes of this third stage deliverable. So all of that gets packaged up by us and sent to Lausanne, delivered to Lausanne by one of our people on February 3rd. That then kicks off a process for the following 7.5 months that culminates in the vote in Lima. Now, in that process, we have the opportunity to meet with and engage with organizations around the Olympic movement, with individual IOC members, and to present at 3 separate events. We make a big presentation in Denmark in April at a sports convention of the International Sports Federations. We then make a big presentation in July in Lausanne to all of the IOC members, which is a technical presentation that outlines everything in our plan and allows us to answer specific questions they pose to us. And then we make a final presentation, which will be quite a show. This will be in Lima the day of the actual vote on September 13th. All 3 cities will do that. In the meantime, the IOC has formed an evaluation commission that consists of 12 members of the IOC and an equal number of their staff. That commission comes to Los Angeles, also visits the other cities. When they come to Los Angeles, we will meet with them. We have a schedule plan that they have outlined for us where they have a chance to see the city, see our venues, pose as many questions as they can think, and receive lots of information from us. It will be a big show in its own right and get a tremendous amount of attention. That will take place between April 22nd and April 26th. That same group of commissioners visits Paris and Budapest in May, and when they finish visiting all 3 cities, they prepare their own evaluation commission report, which they publish and provide to all of the IOC members. So if you will, this is the currency, this is the substantive piece of work that the IOC does to evaluate each of the cities, and all of the members will have this work available to them as they consider what decisions they want to make. Now, to remind all of you, the members are 90 people who live all around the world. Half of them live in Europe. The rest are scattered between North and South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, and the Middle East. And they range from Princess Anne and Prince Albert, people who are world famous and members of royal families, to people who are relatively obscure sports administrators from very small countries who have a background working in the Olympic sports. But we have to actually know as many of them individually as we can. So you're all much more experienced at politics than we are, but we're in a political process now. We have 90 voters, and our goal is to win half of those 90 voters.
So let me ask you. So we are 2024 will be going to Denmark, Lausanne, and Lima.
Yes.
And at these locations, this is where we will engage with or interface with the members, these 90 members?
At those places, for sure. Beyond that, we'll go to places where we think they're likely to be. World championships that take place for various sports where they're
Gotcha.
supporters. So every place that we can see them that is permitted to us by the IOC, we will do whatever we can to see them.
Thank you. Mr. Cedillo, you ever been to Lima?
Not yet,
All right.
but I have my passport.
Okay. Mr. Blumenfield, and then I'll go to you, Mr. Pratt. Mr. Blumenfield, I think, had the first.
Sure. A couple of
Okay,
questions.
sorry.
One, a follow-up on what Mr. Weston was talking about at the beginning. I didn't quite understand it. You're saying we would participate in the decision if there's a change in venue. And I wanted to understand how that would work. Does that mean we have to affirmatively authorize it, or we have to potentially veto it or vote against it? What happens if we don't take action? What is the actual action that's required of us as a council, and what happens if we do nothing?
So the document would require your expressed approval. I would anticipate that as part of this collaborative working relationship that we've developed with LA24, that prior to getting to that point of a disapproval, that LA24 would actually come forward and work with each member of the City Council in laying the groundwork in terms of why a change might be necessary. So there, just because an approval or disapproval would come to you, I imagine that there will be a lot of work before we even get to that point, and that notice would be provided to you. Obviously, if there is a change in venue, it would have to be a situation where LA24 would present why it is necessary. This is part of providing them with the flexibility of determining what is in the best interest of the games. So whether it be a particular sport or a particular venue or opening, closing ceremonies, they're making a judgment in their best independent judgment of what works best for the delivery of the games. And we're relying on them for that.
And I don't expect there to be any problems. This isn't anticipating. I'm assuming everything's going to go smooth as silk, but just to understand the process. So if there is a venue change, what's required is an affirmative vote by
Yes.
this council.
Yes.
And does the mayor have to approve or disapprove that vote? Is it like a legislation, or is it solely a council vote?
So I would probably defer to the city attorney, but typically when we talk about a city approval, it typically is a vote of the city council with the mayor's concurrence.
That's correct. It would be the same process as with anything else this council does. The mayor could veto it, if you will, which could be overridden, as always, by the council with 10 members. Let me add one thing. There is a provision in the Memorandum of Understanding that's pretty common in commercial contracts that consent will not be unreasonably denied or delayed, meaning that one thing said Mr. Bloomfield, what if we don't vote on it? Well, that's not permitted. The council has to take some action, and it can't be because you don't have the color of somebody's tie or something. There's got to be some legitimate basis for doing it.
Right. And again, this is sort of what we don't expect to happen, but just to understand where we're at. The members of the city representatives, the 1/6, how are those representatives chosen?
So the document doesn't specify how they are chosen yet. It just recognizes that the city will determine who the representatives are. So as we get closer to and when the city is elected, we can probably be working on how that designation would take place. But that is for the city of LA to determine who the representatives are.
So they're not necessarily mayoral appointments or council appointments. Because it's up to us to decide through ordinance or something how that's done?
Yes, it will come to you. You will decide what that process is. It's also important to note, while there's a 1/6 representation for the board as well as the committees, there is a provision that requires that there be at least 2 members on each one of those committees or on the board. So that somewhat addresses the mayor versus a council appointment. So, and that was the attempt to ensure that there would be balanced representation by both the city council and the mayor.
And you mentioned there were like 30 different agreements with different groups. Are there any agreements with others, Inglewood, Santa Monica, other cities that are involved? Which cities have had to make agreements?
City of Long Beach, City of Inglewood, City of Carson. I'm looking at my team. I'm not sure if we have other agreements with specific cities who have Santa Monica.
And those agreements are sort of specific to a venue, or are they more holistic in some way?
No, they're specific to a venue in all cases because of what we're doing with our plan in each of those cities.
Okay. And then 2 other quick questions on the sort of the contingency and the insurance aspect of it. We've talked about this before in terms of the state backstop. With this $250 million contingency, how does that play into, when or if the state money is triggered, and how does that work related to all of this? The state contingency, which I guess is discretionary to some extent.
So recall that the state contingency is only really at the very end. They're almost like the payer of last resort. So the 250 that we're talking about as part of this proposed MOU is more like a warning bell to the city council. It's a warning bell that as the planning of the games takes place, that if there is a need for LA24 to tap into that amount, it requires your expressed approval. And that's only going to be necessary if there is some financial shortfall as part of the budget. So the expectation is that 250 that LA24 will be setting aside is that hopefully it will end up as a surplus. If it ends up at a surplus, the issue of the state guarantee never kicks in because there's a surplus. So that was the theory behind that 250. It was to provide a warning signal to the city if there was going to be some fiscal shortfall, and that LA24 would have to come forward and ask for the city's approval to tap into it. But as I've said, the whole point of that was for it to actually result in a surplus at the end of the games, because that's beneficial for the USOC, the IOC, as well as the city.
But just because we may, if we do end up using the full 250 contingency for legitimate contingent items, that doesn't necessarily mean that we then, the next step is the state money, right?
I'm sorry, can you
The
repeat
next,
that?
the next step is not the
The
state money.
next step is not the state money. We
No.
still have to prove that we've exhausted all of our resources and
Well,
bankrupted
to
our
be
city.
clear, should I think very likely that happen, that even with the 250 contingency, which was set aside, that is exhausted, then the city's guarantee would kick in at that point. The state's guarantee doesn't kick in until the city has done $250 million on its own. Again, we think it's very unlikely, but that's the way it works.
And the city's $250 million, I still don't quite have my head around, maybe this isn't the venue for it, but what constitutes that $250 million? It still seems a little amorphous as far as if we ever got to that place, which we obviously all hope and pray we never will, who decides that we've actually hit that mark where the state money kicks in? It's still, those definitions are still unclear to me. I don't know if it's more clear to you, or if that's still being worked on.
Well, even with the state guarantee, that is still subject to an agreement that needs to be written as well. So we don't even know what the state agreement says about the 250. That negotiation has been left to the governor. So until we actually see that, I don't think we can provide any more clarity than what we've said today.
And again, I think it's important to emphasize that the way LA24 and the city have approached that liability is through sort of a layered approach. So, the first is sort of a conservative budgeting process, which has been validated. The second are a number of insurance protections that would kick in. The third is that there's not only the 250, but there's close to a $500 million contingency in total that would be accessed, and then obviously reimbursements from the federal government for public safety related costs, and then ultimately the city, and then finally the state. So that's and so all of that needs to be sort of articulated in terms of how it kicks in, particularly at the last end. But I think Sharon explained it correctly as a warning bell. If in fact it ever comes to the point where the council is being approached to access the 250 that was allocated specifically for the final protection before it hits to the city, then that signals. Now, should the city be awarded the games, then I think at that point there should be a discussion on how to start managing perhaps a special reserve just in case beyond the reserves that the LA24 committee will already establish, and just to provide yet one more layer of protection in addition to our regular reserves that we have for general fund purposes. But it's premature to sort of outline that today. It's really, if we were be fortunate enough to be awarded the games, then it would be advisable to start considering creating a special reserve just to protect the city in the event of.
And the federal guarantee, that's locked in, so if there were some new administration that didn't like Los Angeles, that couldn't be yanked at this point, for example?
I don't know whether there's any real federal guarantee at this point. We don't know what's going to happen. But all indications have been in the past with regard to federal support of these types of events has been that they have been supportive. So based on what has happened in the past, we can be hopeful that that will continue.
And last question, I don't want to take too much time. In the 2010 games, there was a luge participant that was killed in a trial run, and I don't know how I remember reading about that, how the liability played out. How would something like that play into? Is that something that we have specific insurance for, or is that come out of our contingencies?
I'll let Mr. Sykes explain it, but my understanding is that would be an insurable event.
Yes, that's something that we would anticipate having insurance for, that we would procure as part of the budget. So in the budget, there's a very substantial line item for buying insurance, for paying insurance premiums, and it would be to govern exactly that sort of event.
Because in that case, they not only had the liability of the tragic incident, but then they had to reconfigure the luge and do all that other stuff, which cost them money.
Correct, and those are all things that are insurable, and there's an experienced insurance market that's looked at events like that to be able to handle it.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to call on Mr. Price, but before I do that, Andrew wants me to announce to everyone that he is the LA Charger fan. He has his jersey on. And so for those of you who have not been able to find a Charger fan, we have one in our presence today. So with that said, Mr. Price.
And thank you for the report. This is really exciting to see how we are moving forward very methodically and very conservatively to succeed. Question about the 250. Is it I know there's some discussion about how the council or the committee would have some input over how that portion of funding is expended. Is that kind of a typical provision, or is that something new that we're sort of creating with our committee process? And two, I thought, Sharon, you made some reference to distribution of funding, some kind of a distribution that might occur. And did I misunderstand where that was or how that plays in? Could you explain that?
So I can't address whether it's typical. I would defer to LA 24. I would guess that it's probably not typical. With regard to the distribution, the host city contract and the bid city agreement have provisions as it relates to the distribution of surplus funds. So in the event of a situation where there are surplus funds, both of those agreements specify a distribution to the IOC, the USOC, as well as the organizing committee. And that's why we indicated that it is beneficial, because obviously if there is a surplus, everyone benefits. And that was the goal. So that was the 250, as we call it, the warning bell. But also, if it is successful, and if we do end up with a surplus, everybody, including the IOC, USOC, and the OCOG, benefit.
So what is that percentage? Has that been determined yet? Or what's
there is a percentage that is specified. If I remember correctly, there is a distribution of the surplus of 20% to the IOC, 20% to the USOC, and then 60% to the OCOG. Is that correct? Yeah.
Okay. And then you mentioned that we're kind of in the political process now of this effort, that there will be appearing at least at 3 venues. You mentioned Lima, I forgot the other 2 cities. Are there some restrictions on who we can talk to, when we can talk to them? How does that sort of play out?
Yes, many obtuse and obscure restrictions about we're prevented from going to visit a member directly in his or her own country to promote the bid. these restrictions have been in place since we became one of the bidders, and we've had to abide by them. And we get as much guidance as possible from the IOC before we do something. Now, having said that, I think there will be plenty of opportunity as the next 8 months unroll for us to see members in various places. The members are now much more interested in this decision, so they will also seek us out. What they can't do, and what we are not permitted to do, is to invite members to Los Angeles, to have them see what's here, pay for their trip, or do anything of that nature. So we have to find other ways of communicating with them about our advantages and the features that make our bid, in our view, much stronger than our competition.
Well, I'm sure you have a committee here that's going to be willing to help do some outreach.
Thank you.
Whether it's local or foreign travel, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mr. O'Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to commend the really strong, healthy collaboration in this process from the very beginning. It's been evident, and I think it's led to a really great product, and as is evidenced by the presentation today with this MOU. And that's what it's going to take, I think, to have a successful games as well. So whether it's KPMG or the LA 2024 committee, the city family, the various offices, really, really great work on this. You've been flexible. You've been open-minded in hearing our concerns or criticisms. And so I personally really appreciate that, because I think we're on our way to something really great here. Having said all that, I would like to focus in a little bit on the Contingency Fund. And that is, how is that fund to actually be built up? When are we going to know when the surpluses begin and funds begin to be deposited into that fund? What's that process? Because we're not going to really know deficit or surplus until the games are winding down, essentially. We'll have a sense, but we're not going to know a whole lot until right as the games are coming to a close. So what's the mechanism for building that fund?
So we have a budget today. If we're selected to host the games, we will begin to prepare an organizing committee budget, which is really a project budget looking to complete the project by the end of 2024. We will submit a budget at the beginning of every year that is a project budget looking forward to the completion of the games. And that budget will constantly be subject to adjustment, but every year we'll submit a new budget. Remember as well, we'll be meeting with the board of directors of the organizing committee on a regular basis, so they'll see adjustments along the way. But formally, a new budget will be presented every year. In every budget, we'll take the same approach we've taken with the budget we've presented so far, which is to show revenues and anticipated expenses, and the difference between those two is our contingency. If you will, the reserves we have left over to meet unanticipated expenses or shortfalls in revenue. And as we get closer to the actual games, I expect our precision and confidence in the numbers will go way up. In part, over time, we will have much greater information about the sponsorship agreements that we've made with marketing partners, for example. We will have pre-sold a number of tickets to events, and we will have very high confidence in the amount of revenues we'll generate from the contribution from the IOC. So I expect we'll have highly precise information about revenues that will become better and better as time goes on. Likewise, with costs, I believe we'll have very good information about costs. Remember, in these agreements, these 30 agreements that I've described to you, we have specific costs outlined right now in terms of how much we have to pay each of those venue operators. So we'll have some variability in costs. We have predicted, for example, how much it will cost us to build all the temporary overlays and temporary structures we use for the Olympic Games. We won't know the actual cost until we've done that, but as time goes on, our precision about what those expected costs will be will go up. So I anticipate as we get closer to the actual games, we'll have a very, very tight and very good budget. And that will show us, really with a high degree of confidence, how much the contingency is available to us, how much of the reserve we have. And given that the approach and process will be one in which we share with our board and with the city that information, as that information becomes available to us, I think we'll have a very, very good sense, well before the games happen, what to expect. In addition, I think as you'll see in the MOU, we do make specific deposits in the years in advance of the games into a fund, which is, it's really a fund which is a goodwill fund, if you will, to show that we're very cognizant of the fact that the city has authority over a $250 million part of that contingency reserve. And we're only going to use that with the city's approval. So this warning sign approach that Sharon's outlined is one that we're investing in as well.
I like the checks and balances piece. I think that's really good. And I imagine as sponsorship and marketing contracts are signed, then that's real money to be looking at and comparing expenses against, et cetera. And those types of contracts and agreements will be almost immediately once the games are awarded. That type of activity will start almost immediately.
Absolutely. We have an agreement with the U.S. Olympic Committee that we will form a joint marketing venture. And that venture actually begins at the beginning of 2019. But I anticipate we'll be executing during 2018, after we've been awarded the games, a tremendous amount of work with marketing partners. And we'll make announcements about marketing partners and our sponsorship as soon as they're available to us.
Great. One other question that I have, which was partially answered, and that is in terms of the distribution of the surplus once it's clear. So none of that surplus. Let me back up just slightly here. In '84, we had the surplus, and the LE 84 Foundation was born. Might there be a similar example if we have a surplus for LA 2024? Might there be another sports youth foundation for the city of Los Angeles that could come out of this? Have we taken a look at that possibility? One of the things themes that I keep returning to is I want Los Angeles to be better off in 2025 than we were in 2024, having had the Olympics here.
Well, to address the question, we have not specifically addressed what happens with a surplus in the event that we're fortunate enough to have one. But LA 84 is a tremendous model, and we think of LA 84 as one of our most important partners, and the work they've done in the city since the 1984 Olympics is one of the big reasons why the Olympics are popular in Los Angeles.
Right.
So we agree with you entirely.
So I would encourage all of us to start thinking about that, just in terms of the mechanism for getting some incredible legacy off the ground, and bake that into this entire process as we head toward the Olympics. Lastly, Mr. Chair, in terms of, you have explained this before, but it's been a number of months. Can you go over some of the finer points again of the comprehensive insurance plan that offer the city additional protections in addition to this contingency? So I know there's been an abundance of attention and focus paid to protecting the city, our taxpayers, our assets, et cetera. Can you just go over the finer points for all of us one more time in terms of this comprehensive insurance plan?
So as part of preparing the budget, we had quite a bit of discussion with insurance consultants who we've retained. And we've talked quite a bit about that with the city representatives as well, to understand all of the categories of insurance coverage that would be available for an event of this type. Now, there is very good experience with event interruption insurance for disasters and things of that nature, liabilities of every sort, because there are not events that look exactly like the Olympics. The Olympics is bigger than most other events, but if you added a lot of other events together, you'd have something that looks pretty much like the Olympics. So the people who've given us advice have had precedents to look at. They've had specific experiences they can lend to what we're doing, and we have made a specific provision in the budget for a very substantial sum, which we have not publicly disclosed, but the city representatives are aware of it. KPMG is aware of it. KPMG has reviewed our approach to this, and we're quite confident that both the amount of money that we have provided to handle insurance premiums and the amount of insurance that we're hoping to receive or purchase with that premium is substantial enough and would provide us very conservative coverage of every type of insurable risk that we can imagine.
Thank you.
Okay. Just to quickly piggyback on something that Mitchell said, if we chose, and let's thinking positive that there's going to be a surplus, if we chose, or who would be responsible in determining where we would place a surplus, and could we choose to give it to LA 84?
Well, it's not outlined in any of the agreements specifically, although I would say it reverts, the 60% share reverts to the organizing committee. Now, the organizing committee, of course, is set up to include representatives of the city.
Gotcha.
And representatives of the U.S. Olympic Committee. So we clearly will abide by the direction of the board of the organizing committee.
I got it. Okay, I think Mr. Krikorian.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I'm so pleased that our questions have started to revolve around what do we do with the surplus. And I think that's really important. It needs to be remembered that Los Angeles is the only city on planet Earth that has hosted 2 Olympics that have resulted in a surplus. And I'm convinced that because of the work of this committee and the people at this table, we are going to host a 3rd that produces a surplus. And I think we've come so far in getting these assurances and creating a sense of security for the taxpayers of Los Angeles that I've become very much convinced that a surplus is not only possible, but it's a likelihood. And I had one remaining sort of budget question for KPMG. We had a discussion about this at the last meeting. The KPMG model for ticket sale revenue estimates was proposed to be more conservative than the one that was in fact included in the budget. But as I've kind of done it at the back of the envelope, it seems like even with that more conservative revenue assumption for ticket sales, it's a minuscule impact on the budget as a whole. We're estimating almost $1.5 billion in ticket revenues, and even with that more conservative estimate, it's only about a $40 or $50 million difference, which is less than 1/10 of 1% of the overall budget. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. And realistically, there are also areas of the budget where LA 24 was conservative. So there's potential upside in areas that that would definitely offset that.
So even if you used a different model that encompassed different cities as your assumptions, well within the margin of error.
Agreed.
Okay. So with that, I have to say that well, let me talk a little bit about the contingency first, because we're all kind of working through how that works. And what I've heard today kind of reminds me of something that we're all familiar with, which is the reserve in the general fund of the city. And basically, we have budgeted that now, or LA 24 has budgeted $250 million of contingency reserve into their budget, which they would not tap into without amending the budget and would come before the council to do that. In the same way, we don't dip into our reserve without having a very serious discussion about whether or not to do that, what the implications of that would be. Is that a rough metaphor for this?
That was really the template that we were using, since that's what we use. But I would actually add that this MOU goes a step further than even our reserve does, because it actually is prescriptive into the future as to how the contingency reserve will actually be established. There's requirements for a certain level of deposits. It determines what year those deposits will be made, and so it is contractually a responsibility of LA24 to ensure that they establish this reserve as determined by the MOU.
Okay, so the layers of protection are as you laid out, the budget, insurance, the contingency reserve.
There's two reserves. There's a reserve.
Yeah.
There's $500 million approximately in total in reserves, of which about half of it cannot be accessed without your authorization.
So the taxpayers of Los Angeles are not at risk for one dime until all of those scenarios would be exhausted.
That's correct.
Okay, so that brings me back to the surplus then. The state is also one of the guarantors, but I think as we've all discussed, the likelihood of their ever making a contribution to this is virtually nil. I mean, it's nice to have it, but it's really not realistic that would ever be called upon. So when it comes to the surplus, I just want to make sure that there's nothing in the state's legislation or in their assumptions that would suggest that they would benefit from any surplus that we realize through our work and our risk that we take here locally. Is that right?
There isn't anything in the current
Okay.
legislation.
I don't want this to be the Potsdam Conference or something where we give away half of Europe in order to have the, back-end help of Sacramento coming in at the last minute. So
The legislation does not contemplate the state sharing.
excellent. Okay, so with that, members, we've dealt with the contingency. We've dealt with oversight and governance in a way that should, I think, resolve all of our concerns. We've dealt now with the issue of the value proposition based on venues and having oversight to be able to determine whether we still retain the same kind of value proposition with any venue changes. I think, to your point, Mr. Sykes, about the role of city support in the strength of the bid, through this process that we've gone through, I think we've dealt with the risk management issues, which have given us a basis for this very strong and deep partnership that you described. And I think that those who are observing our process from outside should realize that by going through this process, we've built a much stronger partnership between the city and LA24. And I can't think of any reason that anyone would not be strongly supportive of our moving forward. But I look forward to seeing the rest of the submissions for the stage 3, but we are absolutely on the right track. And although, Mr. President,
Yes.
the one other thing I would just want to note for the record, and I'm sure we'll all want to do this as well, consider it taken. This is Mr. Santana's last meeting with this committee, and I think that it's important that the committee report that comes out of this meeting reflects that all of us want to really thank Miguel Santana for the work that he has done on preparing this report and this bid and the tremendous partnership that he has personally built between the city and LA24 and the security that the taxpayers have received through this process because of the work of Miguel Santana. And I think it's important that the committee report reflect that.
Thank you.
Is that an amendment to name the report the Santana report?
We only do that with the budget. Yeah. He won't be around then. So.
Okay,
Why smiling?
are we at, where are we? Up on
Mr.
the end.
Chair?
Yes.
You have two reports before you. One report has the recommendations related to approval of the MOU and instruction for us to report on the host city contract, as well as the venue plan, as well as the opening closing ceremonies plan. And the second report that you have before you is a note and file of the KPMG budget report, as well as the state LAO report.
So our action then is unless there's objection, is to note and file the, I guess, joint CLA-CAO report for dated 12/2/2016, and we will approve that dated 1/11/2017 as amended. Is that all right? Yes?
Yes.
As amended, any objections to the Santana report? I'm sorry, I'm just going to say it anyway. Mr. Santana, we appreciate you. You are, to use the parlance of the Olympics, you are gold for us. You are a champion. The city and its people are indebted to you. You are an incredible Angelino and a great story. And let me begin with thanking you for your great service to the city of Los Angeles. Yes, Mr. Krikorian.
Mr. President, just for the sake of the record, since we do these things often without objection, I think for the sake of the record, can we have the report reflect that this was approved by unanimous vote of every member of the
Yes.
committee?
Let that be the record to bring complete accuracy to the record. Thank you. We are adjourned? All right. Thank you.